Chapter 6. A past that haunts Camelia's hands trembled as she held Nico's phone. The message on the screen burned into her mind. We need to talk. It's about Camelia. She could hear the tick of the clock in the otherwise silent kitchen. She could feel the weight of Nico's gaze pressing down on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she looked up, meeting his unreadable expression. Who sent this? She asked, voice quiet but steady. Nico sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. Someone I don't fully trust, he admitted. Her heart pounded. But they know something. His jaw tightened. Yes. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Every instinct screamed that she was close to something dangerous, to a truth she might not be ready for. But she was done running. Then let's go, she said. Nico studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. Then, finally, he nodded. The cafe was tucked away in a quiet part of the city, far from the sleek luxury of Nico's world. It was small, with fogged-up windows and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. Nico had chosen a booth in the back, his posture tense, his eyes scanning every face that walked in. Camelia could feel the tension radiating from him. Whoever they were meeting, he didn't trust them. A few minutes later, a man slid into the seat across from them. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a simple blazer, but there was something about him that screamed, calculated. His movements were careful, his eyes sharp. Camelia had never seen him before, but the way he looked at her, like he knew her, made her stomach twist. Miss Laurent, he said smoothly, I wasn't sure you'd come. Camelia forced herself to sit straighter. You sent the message. Yes. Her fingers curled against her lap. Who are you? A pause. Then, my name is Marcus Vale, he said. I used to work for your father. The air in Camelia's lungs turned ice cold. She swallowed. Used to? His lips pressed into a thin line. Until I found out what he was hiding. A chill ran down her spine. She turned to Nico, expecting him to look surprised. But he wasn't. He was furious. His entire body had gone rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark and dangerous. You shouldn't be here, Vale, he said, voice low and threatening. Camelia's pulse spiked. Marcus let out a dry chuckle. And yet, here I am. She shifted in her seat, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. You said you had answers, she cut in. About me. Marcus nodded, his expression darkening. I do. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Tell me, Miss Laurent, do you remember anything strange about the last few months? Flashes of things that don't make sense? A feeling that something is missing? Her stomach twisted. Because she did. The way her memories of Nico felt blurred at the edges. The lingering sense of déjà vu. The nightmares that left her gasping for breath. Marcus must have seen something in her face because his expression softened. I'm sorry, he murmured, but you were never supposed to remember. Her breath hitched. A sickening realization clawed at the edge of her mind. Her voice came out hoarse. What are you saying? Marcus exhaled. Then, carefully, he said, Your father erased your memories, Camelia. The words landed like a gunshot. The world tilted. Camelia froze, her entire body locking up. For a second, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Nico was already moving. His hand closed over hers beneath the table, warm, solid, grounding. But she barely noticed. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. No, she whispered. But Marcus's expression was grim. 2 months ago, he said, you started digging too deep into things your father didn't want you to know. You found out something you weren't supposed to. Camelia's breath came in uneven gasps. What? What did I find? She demanded. Marcus hesitated. Then, carefully, he said, You found out that your father wasn't just controlling your life. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He was trying to control your future. Her blood ran cold. A sickening realization crept into her bones. My marriage, she breathed. Marcus nodded. Her hands clenched into fists. Her father had arranged marriages before, had tried to own her choices. But Nico, she had gone to Nico. Hadn't she? Nico's grip on her hand tightened. His voice was low, dangerous. You told me you wanted out, he said softly. Camelia turned to him, her heart pounding. What? His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with something raw and unspoken. You wanted a way out of your father's control, he said, so you came to me. The world blurred around her. She was drowning. Her own father had erased her memories, had stolen her choices, had taken away the one thing she should have remembered, Nico. She shook her head, panic rising in her throat. No, this doesn't make sense. Why would he? Marcus exhaled. Because, he said grimly, he needed you to forget that you were in love with Nico. The air left her lungs. Silence. Nico had moved, his fingers tightened around hers just barely, but his face was utterly unreadable. Her father had stolen her memories, had erased the one thing that could have changed everything. A marriage that wasn't just a mistake. A love story she had chosen. Her pulse roared in her ears. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Camellia realized the biggest danger wasn't Nico. It was the truth, and the man who had tried to bury it. Chapter 7. Love Against the Odds. Camellia barely remembered leaving the cafe. Her legs moved on instinct, but her mind was stuck in a loop. Your father erased your memories. You weren't supposed to remember. You were in love with Nico. The words wouldn't stop circling in her head, colliding with everything she thought she knew. The icy wind bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Somewhere behind her, Nico was keeping pace. Silent, watchful. He hadn't touched her since they left. Not even when she had stumbled on the sidewalk, her pulse too loud in her ears, but his presence was a weight she couldn't ignore. Strong, constant, unshaken. Unlike her. Her hands trembled as she reached the car. Nico opened the door for her, but she hesitated before stepping inside. For the first time, she was afraid to be alone with him. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she might have once loved him, and she didn't know what that meant anymore. The drive was silent. Nico didn't try to speak, and Camellia didn't know what to say. Her world had just been rewritten. The man she had spent days resisting, distrusting, he was the man she had chosen, but she couldn't remember why. By the time they reached the penthouse, her hands were still shaking. She stepped inside, but the air felt different. She felt different. Like the walls around her weren't just Nico's. They had once been hers. Her gaze caught on small things. A book on the coffee table with a page slightly dog-eared, something she would have done. A bottle of perfume on the dresser that smelled achingly familiar. A blanket draped over the couch, soft and worn, like someone had used it night after night. A sickening realization settled deep in her bones. She had lived here. She had been his wife in more than just name. Her chest squeezed painfully. She turned to Nico, who stood by the door, watching her carefully. "How long was I here?" she whispered. His expression didn't change, but his voice was quiet when he said, 2 months. She swallowed, and before that, a beat of silence. Then, "You moved in with me 3 weeks after we met." The air left her lungs. 3 weeks. Her whole life she had been cautious. She had kept walls up, never letting anyone close. But she had let him in. She had chosen him. Her fingers curled at her sides. "Why?" Nico exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You told me you wanted to be free," he said, "from your father, from the life he had built for you." A shiver ran down her spine. "And you?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. His dark eyes met hers, steady. "What about me?" She swallowed hard. "Why did you let me stay?" For the first time, something raw flashed in his gaze. "Because I wanted you to," he said simply. Her breath caught. The weight of his words settled deep inside her. Nico had never been desperate for her trust, never begged her to believe him, because at some point she already had. She looked away, her heart hammering. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. She expected him to push, to try and remind her of whatever they had been before, but instead he nodded. "You don't have to," he said. "Not yet." The restraint in his voice made her chest ache. She didn't know if she was ready to believe in what they had been, but a part of her wanted to try. So she whispered, "Tell me about us." Nico stilled. Then, slowly, he moved closer, each step measured, like he was giving her time to pull away. She didn't. He stopped inches away, his voice impossibly soft. "You hated me at first." That startled a small laugh out of her, breathless and shaky. His lips quirked, but his eyes were serious. "You thought I was dangerous," he murmured. "And were you?" His gaze darkened. "Not to you." The air between them felt charged. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She didn't know who made the first move. 1 second, there was space between them. The next, Nico was close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, the scent of his cologne, the slow, restrained rise and fall of his chest, and God, he felt familiar. Her fingers twitched at her sides, an instinct she couldn't place, a longing her heart seemed to know better than her mind, and then a flicker, a sensation, sharp and sudden, like a memory on the verge of breaking free. Flash. Her hand in his, fingers interlocked, the city lights blurring as he pulled her through the rain, both of them laughing, breathless. Flash. His voice low and rough, whispering her name in the dark. Flash. A kiss, urgent and desperate, her hands fisting in his shirt as he pressed her against the door. Camellia gasped, stumbling back. The memories shattered before she could grasp them fully. But they had been real, and they had been hers. Nico caught her wrists before she could fall, his grip steady. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was something else there, too. Something like hope. Camelia's breath came in shallow gasps. She wasn't ready for this. Not yet. But for the first time since waking up in that hotel room, she wasn't sure she wanted to run from it either. So she forced herself to meet his gaze, even as her heart pounded. "I think," she whispered. "I think I want to remember." Nico exhaled, his grip on her tightening just slightly. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she saw something close to relief in his eyes. Chapter 8, A Love Story Rewritten. Camellia barely slept. The weight of everything, her erased past, the fractured memories clawing their way back, the truth of her marriage, pressed down on her chest, leaving her restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of Nico, of a life she couldn't quite remember but felt in every inch of her soul. A love she had forgotten but maybe not lost. She sat up in bed, pressing a hand to her racing heart. Across the room, Nico stood near the window, bathed in the soft glow of the city lights. He had barely left her side since their conversation, but he hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded that she remember. Instead, he had watched, waited, like he had been waiting for far longer than she knew. Camellia swallowed hard. "Nico." His head turned slightly, but he didn't speak. She took a shaky breath. "Tell me how it happened." He didn't ask what. He already knew. Nico turned fully, stepping toward her. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the city outside. Then his voice, low, steady. "You came to me," he said. "The night before your father was set to announce your engagement to someone else. You told me you would rather marry a stranger than be trapped under his control." Camelia's pulse pounded. She had known her father was ruthless. But this? "What did I say?" she whispered. Nico's jaw tightened. "You asked me if I would marry you." A breath shuddered past her lips, her own words, her own choice. "And you said yes." Nico exhaled. "I said yes because I wanted to protect you, because I wanted to give you a way out." A lump formed in her throat, but there was something unsaid in his voice, something deeper. She met his gaze, searching. "And that's the only reason?" His fingers curled at his sides. Silence stretched between them, tense, fragile. "Then I said yes," he murmured, "because I didn't want to lose you." Her breath hitched. She wasn't prepared for the way her heart ached at his words, because deep inside her something remembered. The way she had once felt safe with him, the way his presence had meant freedom, not a cage, the way she had chosen him when no one else had. A sudden sharp pain shot through her head. She gasped, clutching her temples as memories surged. Flash, their fingers interlaced in the dark as she whispered, "Tell me, we'll never regret this." His voice rough with emotion. "Never." Flash, Nico pressing a kiss to her temple, his arms wrapped tightly around her as she broke down in his embrace, whispering, "You're the only one who sees me." Flash. A moment in the rain, her laughter echoing as he pulled her close, her body fitting against his like it belonged there, like she belonged to him. The memories crashed into her all at once. She had loved him, she had fought for this, and her father had taken it all away. Tears burned her eyes as she looked up at him. Nico. His expression was unreadable, but his hands twitched, like he was holding himself back, like he was afraid to hope. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I remember." Nico's breath left him in a quiet exhale. His dark eyes searched hers, his expression flickering between relief and restraint. "Are you sure?" His voice was hoarse, careful. Camellia nodded, even as fresh tears slid down her cheeks. "I remember asking you to marry me." Her voice trembled. "I remember why I chose you." Her fingers curled into fists. "I remember loving you." A sharp exhale left him, but he didn't move, didn't dare move, because this was her choice now, not the past, not the stolen memories, hers. Camellia took a shaky step forward to stack then another, and then her fingers reached for his, slow, tentative. But when their hands touched, electricity surged between them. Nico inhaled sharply. His grip on her was hesitant, like he was giving her one last chance to walk away. She didn't. Instead, she whispered, "I don't care what my father tried to take from me." Her other hand lifted, pressing flat against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "All I care about," she whispered, "is if you still want me." A sound left him, low, almost pained. Then his restraint shattered. Nico pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, his hold desperate and unrelenting. His forehead pressed against hers, his breath uneven. "I never stopped," he admitted, voice raw. "I never will." A sob caught in her throat, but it wasn't pain. It was relief. It was love rediscovered. And when Nico kissed her, it wasn't careful. It was fierce, a reclaiming, a promise, a love story rewritten, not by fate, not by memory, but by choice. And this time, nothing would take it away. Epilogue 1 year later. The Mediterranean sun cast a golden glow over the private villa, its rays shimmering against the endless blue of the sea. A warm breeze drifted through the open balcony doors, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. Camellia sat on the terrace, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her wineglass, watching as the waves kissed the shore. It was still surreal sometimes, this life, a life she had chosen. Not one dictated by her father, not one erased and rewritten, but hers and his. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her against a solid, warm chest. She didn't even have to turn. She knew. Nico pressed a slow kiss to the curve of her neck, his voice low and indulgent. "Why are you hiding out here?" she sighed, leaning back against him. "I like the quiet." His lips quirked against her skin. "Liar," she smirked. "Fine. I was trying to get away from your terrifying grandmother. I'm convinced she wants to see us have at least 5 children." Nico let out a quiet chuckle, the deep vibration of it sending warmth curling through her. "She's just excited you're officially part of the family now." Camellia bit her lip, her fingers playing with the diamond ring on her left hand. A real wedding in front of the people they loved. Not a desperate elopement in a Vegas chapel. It had taken a year to get here. A year of choosing each other every single day, of rebuilding what had been taken, of fighting back against the world and winning. She turned in Nico's arms, her hands settling on his chest as she met his gaze. He was her husband, not because of fate, not because of circumstance, but because she had never stopped loving him. And this time she had remembered. She reached up, brushing a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead, her thumb grazing against the scar at his temple, the one he had gotten protecting her. "Are you happy?" she whispered. Nico exhaled, his fingers sliding along the small of her back, pulling her closer. "There was never a version of my life where I didn't want you," he murmured. "I'm just grateful you found your way back to me." Her throat tightened, because in the end, she had been the one who left him. Not by choice, not willingly, but she had been the one who forgot. And still, Nico had waited, had fought for her even when she didn't remember what they were fighting for. She lifted onto her toes, pressing a slow, lingering kiss against his lips. A silent promise that this time she was staying, that this love, this life, was theirs, forever. The end. And that's a wrap on I Woke Up in a Hotel Room with a Wedding Ring and a Man Who Refuses to Divorce Me. Camellia and Nico's journey was filled with angst, mystery, slow burn tension, and an unforgettable love that defied the odds. From a marriage neither of them expected to a love they both fought for, their story proves that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones we choose, again and again. If you love this book, don't forget to subscribe for more slow burn romance, heart-stopping twists, and unforgettable love stories. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your favorite moments. Share this story with fellow romance lovers. Stay tuned for more stories, more drama, and more love that refuses to be forgotten. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time.